Imagine standing beside a quiet road in the Virginia countryside, sometime in the early decades of the 19th century. The morning air is cool and still. The Blue Ridge Mountains rise in the distance, their ridgelines softened by a thin layer of morning mist that has not yet burned away in the sun. The trees along the road are old, oak and hickory and pine, their roots reaching deep into red Virginia soil that has been here since long before any road was laid across it. A mockingbird calls from somewhere in the trees and then falls silent, and the quiet returns, complete and unhurried. In a modest inn somewhere in this landscape, a locked iron box sits in a back room. It has been left in the care of the innkeeper by a traveler who passed through some years before. A man described as tall, well-spoken, and quietly confident, who paid for his lodgings without complaint and said very little about his business. The traveler promised to return or to send instructions. Neither the man nor any word from him ever came back. Inside that box, if the story is to be believed, are 3 pages covered entirely in numbers. Row after row of them, written in careful columns, giving away nothing to any eye that cannot read their language. And according to the letters also found inside the box, those numbers, properly understood, describe the location of an enormous buried treasure. Gold and silver and jewels accumulated during a journey into the American frontier, concealed somewhere in the hills of Bedford County, Virginia, and waiting there still. Whether any of this is entirely true is a question that historians, cryptographers, and careful researchers have been asking for nearly 2 centuries. And that question, patient, unresolved, and genuinely fascinating, is where our journey tonight begins. If these quiet journeys through history bring you some peace at the end of a long day, History Sleepy Time would be honored to have you along. Take a moment to subscribe and let us know where you are listening from tonight. We would love to welcome you. Now let us return to the quiet hills of Virginia. The story of the Beale Treasure Papers, as it has come down to us through history, begins not with gold or adventure or cryptography, but with something far more ordinary, an act of trust between 2 strangers in a Virginia inn. It is a beginning that tells us something important about the era in which this story is set, a time when trust between individuals was often the only reliable institution available in the absence of banks, telegraph lines, legal contracts, or any of the other mechanisms that modern life uses to move information and value from one person to another. The inn in question was located in Lynchburg, Virginia, a town situated in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains along the James River. In the early 19th century, Lynchburg was a modest but growing community, a market town serving the tobacco farmers, livestock traders, and travelers who moved through the region. Its taverns and inns functioned not only as places of rest, but as social institutions, the places where business was conducted, news was exchanged, and the informal networks of commerce and communication that held frontier communities together were maintained day by day. The innkeeper who figures centrally in this story is identified in the documents as Robert Morris, described in the published account as a man of considerable personal reputation, honest, discreet, and well regarded in the community he served. According to the narrative that accompanies the Beale Papers as they were eventually published, Morris received a locked iron box from the traveler Thomas J. Beale during one of Beale's visits to Lynchburg, with the understanding that the box was to be held in safekeeping until Beale or someone authorized by him came to collect it. Morris agreed to this arrangement, placed the box in his keeping, and waited for the promised instructions to arrive. They never did. Years passed. Morris held the box, apparently reluctant to open it without authorization, maintaining the trust that had been placed in him with a patience that speaks well of his character as the story presents it. When he finally did open the box, he found inside it 3 pages of numbers, several letters written in plain English, and a set of instructions that asked him to attempt to decode the numbered pages, and if successful to locate the treasure they described and distribute it according to the directions provided. The letters also explained that a key necessary for decoding the ciphers had been sent separately to a trusted friend, but no such key was ever received by Morris or by anyone else on record. What Robert Morris held in his hands at that moment, and what he eventually passed along to another man who would eventually publish the entire collection in a small pamphlet in 1885, was either one of the most remarkable documents in American frontier history, or one of the most carefully constructed literary puzzles ever assembled in the young republic. Nearly 2 centuries later, that distinction remains genuinely unclear, and the uncertainty itself has become a significant part of the story's enduring appeal. The central figure in this story is a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale, a name that carries, perhaps intentionally, an echo of one of the most famous names in American history. Whether that echo was deliberate, coincidental, or simply a reflection of the era's common practice of naming children after founding heroes, is one of the smaller questions that surrounds a figure who, in almost every important respect, remains historically elusive. What the Beale Papers themselves tell us about Thomas Beale is this: he was a Virginian, apparently well-educated and of comfortable social standing, who led or participated in a series of extended expeditions into the American frontier during the period between approximately 1817 and 1821. He is described in the accompanying letters as a man of good character and personal charm, someone whose company was valued by those who knew him. The letters attributed to him are written in clear, grammatical English, suggesting a man with at least a solid basic education, which would have been characteristic of a certain class of Virginia gentlemen in that period. Beyond what the papers themselves report, the historical record becomes considerably thinner. Researchers and historians who have attempted to verify Thomas J. Beale's existence through independent documentary evidence, birth records, land ownership documents, tax records, military service records, court documents, or any of the other archival materials that typically survive from this period and location, have found no confirmed record of a person by this name in the relevant Virginia county records. That absence of documentation is one of the central arguments made by those who question the authenticity of the Beale Papers, and it is a genuinely significant point. Virginia in the early 19th century was not a poorly documented society. Land transactions, court appearances, tax assessments, and church records from this period exist in considerable quantity for many individuals of far less apparent social standing than Beale is described as having. It is worth noting, as a matter of historical fairness, that the absence of documentary evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Record survival from this period is uneven, and records have been lost through fire, flood, neglect, and the general attrition of time. Some researchers have suggested possible identifications of Thomas Beale with individuals of similar or related names who do appear in period records, though none of these proposed identifications has achieved anything close to scholarly consensus. The question of whether Thomas J. Beale was a real historical person, and if so, who exactly he was, remains one of the genuinely open questions that surrounds this story. What can be said with somewhat more confidence is that the type of person the papers describe, a Virginia gentleman of the early Republic era. Comfortable traveling long distances on horseback, experienced with frontier conditions, and connected to networks of companions willing to undertake extended wilderness expeditions, was a real social type in early 19th century America. Such men existed. They traveled. They accumulated and sometimes lost wealth in ways that left incomplete records behind them. The question is whether Thomas J. Beale was one of them, or whether he was a literary creation designed to inhabit the role convincingly. To understand the world in which the Beale story is set, it helps to spend a quiet moment with the America of the early 19th century, a young nation still working out in practical and sometimes difficult terms what independence actually meant for the people living within its expanding boundaries. The United States of 1817, the year in which the Beale expedition supposedly departed, was a country of approximately 9 million people, most of them living east of the Appalachian Mountains in a settled landscape of farms, small towns, and the occasional growing city. Beyond the mountains, the continent stretched westward in a vastness that most Americans of that era had never seen and could barely imagine. Virginia in this period was one of the most established and, in certain respects, most culturally self-conscious of the American states. It had produced more presidents than any other state and considered itself, with some justification, the intellectual and social center of the young republic. Lynchburg, where the Beale story is rooted, was a community embedded in the rhythms of the Virginia tobacco economy, a society built on agriculture, on local commerce, and on the networks of personal relationship and reputation that held small communities together across long distances. The frontier that lay beyond the settled East was a genuinely different world. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had added an enormous territory to the United States, whose interior was known to American authorities only in the vaguest terms. The Lewis and Clark expedition, returning in 1806, had opened a window onto the far west that many Americans found both exciting and difficult to fully comprehend. In the years that followed, a steady movement of trappers, traders, hunters, and explorers pushed further and further into the continent's interior, following rivers and mountain passes into landscapes that no map had yet captured in reliable detail. The Rocky Mountain fur trade, which reached its commercial peak during the 1820s and 1830s, was one of the primary engines of westward exploration in this period. The mountain men who worked the beaver streams of the Rockies and the high plateaus of the Great Basin were among the most geographically knowledgeable people in America at that time, carrying in their heads a practical understanding of routes, water sources, weather patterns, and terrain that would not be captured on printed maps for years or decades. It was into this world, uncertain, unmapped, occasionally dangerous, and genuinely rich in natural resources, that the Beale narrative places its central expedition. The plausibility of a Virginia gentleman organizing a private hunting and exploration party into the frontier interior during this period is, historians generally agree, not inherently difficult to accept. Such expeditions did occur. The question is always whether this particular one, with its specific and remarkable outcome, actually took place as described. According to the letters found inside the locked box, Thomas Beale's first journey westward began in the autumn of 1817. When he departed from Virginia at the head of a party of approximately 30 men, described as companions, and in some accounts as a hunting party, though the narrative makes clear that the expedition was undertaken with a spirit of genuine exploration rather than simple sport. The route they followed is described only in general terms, leading them eventually into the territory of the American Southwest, into regions that were at that time still nominally under Spanish colonial administration, though the grip of that administration on its northern frontier was by 1817 already weakening in ways that would lead to Mexican independence 4 years later. The narrative describes a journey of considerable length and difficulty, months of travel across terrain that was by turns beautiful and severe, through mountains and plains and desert country that tested the party's endurance and resourcefulness. The men hunted as they traveled, living in part off the land in the manner typical of frontier expeditions of the era. They moved through landscapes that few, if any, Americans from the settled East had previously seen, following routes that the narrative leaves deliberately vague perhaps. Some researchers have suggested because vagueness about the route was part of the original design, a way of protecting the secrecy of whatever they eventually found. What the letters claim they found, somewhere in the mountains of what is now understood to be the general region of the American Southwest, was a deposit of gold and silver, or of considerable richness. The narrative does not claim that the party discovered a mine in the conventional sense, a shaft or an underground working, but rather that they encountered surface or deposits of exceptional quality in a location they were able to work with the equipment available to them. The party spent some time extracting ore, and then, as the narrative continues, made their way back towards civilization to have the ore refined and to acquire the supplies necessary for a return expedition. Beale returned to Lynchburg during this period, staying at Morris's Inn and apparently conducting himself as described, pleasantly, discreetly, and without volunteering information about the purpose of his travels. He departed again for a second expedition, and the letters suggest that additional ore was extracted and transporting back to Virginia on subsequent journeys. The accumulated wealth, according to the narrative, was eventually transporting to Bedford County, Virginia, where it was buried at a location described in one of the 3 cipher pages. This narrative, taken on its own terms, is a coherent and not entirely implausible account of frontier exploration and discovery. Mineral deposits were found in various parts of the American Southwest during this era, and private expeditions into frontier territory were not uncommon. What makes the Beale narrative distinctive is not the journey itself, but what was done with the journey's results. The decision to encode the treasure's location in ciphers and to entrust those ciphers to an innkeeper in Lynchburg, with the expectation that a decoding key would eventually follow through a separate channel. Why a man of apparent intelligence and resources would choose this particular method of safeguarding his discovery rather than the more straightforward alternatives available to him, is one of the questions that the narrative raises without fully answering, and one of the details that skeptics have pointed to as evidence that the story may be more literary than historical. The second of the 3 Beale ciphers, the only one that has ever been successfully decoded, as we will come to understand in some detail, claims to describe the contents of a buried cache of considerable value. According to the decoded text, the treasure consists of approximately 2,921 pounds of gold and 5,100 pounds of silver, along with jewels of unspecified type and quantity, said to have been acquired in St. Louis during the return journey from the frontier and subsequently added to the cache. The gold and silver figures are quite specific enough that researchers have spent considerable effort attempting to verify whether those quantities would be consistent with what could plausibly have been extracted and transporting under the circumstances the narrative describes. Estimates of the treasure's current monetary value, if the account is accurate and the treasure remains where it was supposedly buried, have varied enormously depending on the price of gold and silver at the time of calculation and the assumptions made about the jewelry component. Various researchers over the years have placed the figure at somewhere between $20 million and $60 million in contemporary terms, though these estimates carry considerable uncertainty and should be understood as rough approximations rather than precise calculations. The pamphlet published in 1885 provided its own estimate of the value in terms of the dollar values of that era, a figure that was already impressive by the standards of the time. The question of why someone would go to the considerable trouble and expense of burying such a quantity of wealth, rather than depositing it in a bank or distributing it among the party members, is addressed in the letters attributed to Beale. The explanation offered is essentially one of communal responsibility. The treasure belonged not to Beale alone, but to the entire party of roughly 30 men, and the burial was intended as a form of collective safekeeping, with the intention that if anything happened to the party during subsequent frontier expeditions, the wealth would still be recoverable by their families or heirs, provided the decoding instructions reached the right hands in time. This explanation has a certain internal logic, and it reflects a genuine practical concern that men undertaking dangerous frontier expeditions in the early 19th century might reasonably have had. The frontier was not a safe place. Men died on expeditions from accident, illness, injury, and conflict with peoples whose territory they were entering. The idea of providing some form of security for dependents left behind was not foreign to the culture of the era. Whether the specific mechanism chosen, a set of ciphers entrusted to an innkeeper, with a separate key promised through another channel, represents the most sensible available option is another matter, and one that researchers continue to discuss with varying degrees of skepticism. What the treasure story provides, regardless of its ultimate truth, is a framework that gives the cipher pages their claimed significance. Without the treasure story, the numbers are simply numbers. With it, they become a puzzle with an enormous potential answer. And that combination of puzzle and prize has proven, across nearly 2 centuries of American history, to be one of the most durable intellectual and imaginative attractions the country has ever produced. The physical heart of the Beale mystery consists of 3 pages of numbers, each representing a separate encoded message. These pages, as they have been reproduced and published since 1885, present to any reader exactly what the innkeeper Robert Morris reportedly encountered when he finally opened the iron box: columns of numbers apparently random, arranged in sequences that give no immediate indication of their meaning to anyone reading them without a key. The first cipher, which according to the accompanying narrative describes the precise location of the buried treasure, consists of a long series of numbers that researchers have analyzed extensively without achieving a universally accepted solution. The numbers in this cipher range from small values to numbers in the hundreds, and their distribution has been studied using various cryptographic methods in the hope of identifying patterns that might suggest a particular key text. No confirmed solution has emerged. The second cipher, which describes the contents of the treasure itself, is the one that has been decoded, and the method of its decoding, which we will explore in some detail, involved matching the cipher numbers to the Declaration of Independence, with each number corresponding to the first letter of the word at that position in the document. When this method is applied to cipher number 2, a readable English text emerges, describing the treasure's composition in terms consistent with the narrative provided in the accompanying letters. The decoded text is not perfectly rendered. There are irregularities and apparent errors in the correspondence between numbers and letters, but the overall message is sufficiently coherent to be convincing as a legitimate decoding. The third cipher, which according to the narrative provides the names and addresses of the heirs entitled to share in the treasure, has resisted every serious decoding attempt thus far. If genuine, this is the cipher whose contents might be of the most immediate practical importance. The names it claims to contain would, if recovered, identify real individuals or their descendants, and potentially provide additional historical evidence about the story's authenticity. Its continued resistance to solution has been a source of frustration for researchers and a source of undiminished curiosity for everyone who encounters the story. The physical appearance of the ciphers, as reproduced in the 1885 pamphlet and in subsequent scholarly discussions, is relatively straightforward. The numbers are arranged in rows across the page, without obvious punctuation or spacing that would indicate word boundaries. The density of numbers on each page and the range of values present are consistent with what cryptographers would expect from a book cipher of this type, though, as we will discuss, that consistency does not by itself confirm authenticity. Since a sophisticated forger would presumably have been aware of what a genuine book cipher should look like. What the three ciphers represent, in the broadest sense, is a division of information into separate components, each of which is useless without the others. The location cipher without the contents cipher tells you where to dig, but not what to expect. The contents cipher without the location cipher tells you what is buried, but not where. The names cipher, Unsolved, holds whatever record exists of who the treasure was intended to benefit. Together, the 3 pages are claimed to constitute a complete system of documentation, the kind of careful compartmentalization that someone genuinely concerned with security might design. Whether they were designed by a cautious frontier entrepreneur or by a skilled literary craftsman is the question that everything else in this story circles around. Before we can fully appreciate what makes the Beale ciphers remarkable and what makes them so persistently difficult to solve, it helps to spend a quiet moment understanding how ciphers of this particular type actually function. Cryptography, the practice of encoding information so that only intended recipients can read it, is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest intellectual tools in human history, used by military commanders, diplomats, merchants, and private individuals across thousands of years of civilization to protect information from eyes it was not meant for. The most basic form of cipher is the substitution cipher, in which each letter of the original message is replaced by a different letter, number, or symbol according to a fixed rule. A simple example would be replacing every letter with the one that follows it in the alphabet, so the word gold becomes HPME. Anyone who knows the rule can reverse the substitution and read the original message. Anyone who does not know the rule faces the task of figuring it out from the encoded text alone, which is possible with enough material to analyze, because the letters of any language appear with characteristic frequencies that leave identifiable patterns even in encoded text. A more sophisticated version of the substitution cipher is the book cipher, which is the type that appears to have been used in the Beale Papers. In a book cipher, the key is not a simple rule, but a specific text, a document, a page from a book, or any other piece of writing that both the sender and the intended recipient possess. The encoding works as follows. The sender takes the key text, numbers each word in sequence, and then encodes the message by replacing each letter with the number of a word in the key text whose first letter matches it. So if the message begins with the letter W, and the third word in the key text begins with W, the encoded message begins with the number 3. To decode such a cipher, the recipient needs to know which text was used as the key, number that text's words in the same way, and then look up each number in the encoded message to find the corresponding first letter. Without knowing which text was used, the decoding task is enormously difficult because the number of possible key texts, every book, pamphlet, letter, speech, legal document, or piece of writing that existed at the relevant time, is effectively unlimited. Even with modern computational tools, testing every possible key text against an encoded message is a task of formidable complexity. Book ciphers were genuinely used in the 19th century. They were popular among military and diplomatic correspondents precisely because they offered strong security without requiring the parties involved to memorize complex rules. The key was simply a document both parties agreed upon in advance. Thomas Jefferson himself, one of the era's most intellectually curious minds, and a man whose name resonates interestingly alongside the name of Thomas Jefferson Beale, was deeply interested in cryptography and corresponded with James Madison and others about various cipher systems. The Jefferson wheel, a cylindrical cipher device attributed to Jefferson's design, was a genuine cryptographic innovation of the early Republic period. The existence of a real culture of cipher use in early 19th century America is one of the details that researchers who support the Beale Papers' authenticity point to as evidence that the story's cryptographic elements are plausible rather than anachronistic. A Virginia gentleman of the early Republic era who knew something of cryptography and wanted to protect important information would have had good cultural reasons to reach for a book cipher as his tool of choice. What remains uncertain, as always, is whether the Beale Papers represent a genuine historical use of this technique or a later literary simulation of it. The story of how cipher number 2 was decoded is in its own quiet way one of the more remarkable episodes in American cryptographic history, not because the solution required extraordinary technical sophistication, but because of the particular document that turned out to be the key and what its use tells us or seems to tell us about the person who created the cipher. The decoding is attributed in the 1885 pamphlet to the unnamed narrator, who states that he spent years attempting various possible key texts against the ciphers without success before trying the Declaration of Independence. When he applied that document to cipher number 2, numbering each word of the declaration in sequence, and then using those numbers to recover the first letters of the encoded message, a readable text emerged. The message, as decoded, provides an inventory of the buried treasure consistent with the narrative in the surrounding letters. Quantities of gold and silver, a reference to the jewels, and a general indication that the materials were stored in iron pots with iron covers in a vault roughly 6 feet below the surface. The decoded text is not entirely clean. There are a number of numerical discrepancies where the number in the cipher does not correspond cleanly to any word in the declaration. And there are apparent errors in the encoding that suggest either carelessness on the part of the original encoder, or, as skeptics have argued, evidence that the cipher was constructed imperfectly, perhaps by someone working backward from a desired plaintext, rather than encoding a genuinely pre-existing message. These irregularities have been analyzed carefully by cryptographers, and interpretations of what they mean differ considerably depending on the analyst's broader view of the paper's authenticity. What the successful decoding of Cipher No. 2 established for the many people who have engaged with the Beale mystery since the pamphlet's publication was a proof of concept. If one of the three ciphers could be decoded using the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the other two also used that document or a related foundational American text as their key. This possibility has been tested extensively, and the results have been consistently disappointing. Neither Cipher No. 1 nor Cipher No. 3 yields coherent text when the declaration is applied to them in any of the standard ways researchers have tried. If those ciphers use book cipher keys, the keys appear to be different documents, and identifying those documents has proven, across nearly a century and a half of effort, to be beyond the reach of every approach attempted so far. The choice of the Declaration of Independence as a cipher key, if it is genuine, is itself an interesting detail. The Declaration was not the most obscure or the most easily obtainable document in early 19th century America. It was, by that period, already understood as a foundational national text, reprinted widely and available in various forms across the country. Using it as a cipher key would have required the intended recipient to possess a copy with consistent word numbering, which could be arranged in advance, but would also have required some care about which specific printing was used, since different printings sometimes contained minor textual variations. The details suggests a person comfortable with the idea of using a well-known national document as an encoding tool, someone for whom the Declaration was a natural reference point, which would be consistent with a certain kind of educated Virginia gentleman of the early Republic era. Whether the choice also carries symbolic meaning, the use of America's founding Statement of Rights and Freedoms as the key to a document about wealth accumulated on the American frontier is the kind of interpretive question that the Beale mystery invites without providing any reliable way to answer. If the successful decoding of Cipher No. 2 brought a kind of partial satisfaction to the long history of Beale research, the continued resistance of the other two ciphers has provided a counterweight of frustration that has kept the mystery feeling genuinely open across all the decades that have followed. Cipher No. 1, which supposedly describes the location of the buried treasure, and Cipher No. 3, which allegedly contains the names and addresses of the heirs, have been subjected to an extraordinary range of analytical approaches by an equally extraordinary range of people, professional cryptographers, academic researchers, amateur puzzle enthusiasts, and everyone in between. The approaches attempted have included testing virtually every significant text from the early 19th century as a possible key: the Bible, the Federalist Papers, various editions of popular books and almanacs, speeches, legal documents, and many other candidates. Statistical analysis has been applied to the number distributions in both unsolved ciphers, looking for patterns that might suggest a particular type of key or constrain the search space in useful ways. Researchers have considered the possibility that the ciphers use a modified version of the declaration, with different word numbering, different starting points, or different textual variants, without finding a version that produces coherent text from either of the unsolved pages. One persistent challenge in analyzing the unsolved ciphers is that without a confirmed solution, it is very difficult to distinguish between a genuine cipher that uses an unidentified key and a set of numbers that were constructed to look like a cipher without actually encoding a coherent message. A sophisticated hoaxer who wanted to create convincing-looking cipher pages could, in principle, generate numbers that passed basic statistical tests without actually encoding anything retrievable. Distinguishing between these possibilities from the outside without access to the key requires very careful analysis, and even then may not yield a definitive answer. Some researchers have noted statistical properties of cipher number 1 that they argue are consistent with it being a genuine book cipher. Properties related to the distribution of number values and the frequency patterns within the cipher that would be difficult to fake convincingly without considerable cryptographic sophistication. Others have pointed to features of the same cipher that they argue suggest it is not a genuine encoded message. The debate among cryptographers who have examined the Beale papers has not produced a consensus on this question. And the absence of consensus is itself a meaningful piece of information. It tells us that the ciphers are at minimum not obviously and immediately dismissible as crude fakes, but also that they have not yielded to any of the analytical approaches that have successfully cracked other historical ciphers of comparable apparent complexity. The possibility that the key documents for the unsolved ciphers exist somewhere in the historical record but have simply not been identified correctly is one that continues to motivate researchers. The range of texts available in early 19th century Virginia was large but not unlimited, and with sufficient computational resources and a systematic approach, it is theoretically possible to test a very large number of candidate texts against the unsolved ciphers in a reasonable amount of time. Whether such an effort would produce a genuine solution or simply confirm that no recoverable solution exists is a question that only the attempt can answer, and it is an attempt that, in various forms, continues to this day. Everything that is publicly known about the Beale papers derives ultimately from a single source, a small pamphlet published in Lynchburg, Virginia, in 1885, under the title The Beale Papers. The pamphlet was authored, or at least edited and arranged, by a man named James B. Ward, who identified himself in the publication as the person to whom Robert Morris had eventually entrusted the box and its contents after years of unsuccessful personal effort to decode the ciphers. Ward's pamphlet contains the full text of the 3 ciphers as reproduced from the originals, the letters attributed to Thomas Beale, and a narrative account of how the papers came to be published. The publication history of the pamphlet is one of the areas where careful historical research has been most productive and most revealing. Ward's publication appears to have been a modest affair, a locally printed document distributed in limited quantities that attracted relatively little immediate attention in the broader press. The pamphlet sold for 50 cents, a not insignificant sum for the era, and Ward's preface explicitly disavows any personal financial motivation, stating that he is publishing the papers in the hope that they will reach someone capable of solving the remaining ciphers. Whether this disclaimer should be taken entirely at face value, as researchers have noted, is one of the questions that the pamphlet itself raises. The physical production of the 1885 pamphlet has been examined by researchers interested in its typography, paper, and printing characteristics, in the hope that these physical details might help confirm or question the publication's claims about its own origins. The results of these examinations have been inconclusive in some respects and suggestive in others. Some analyses have noted that certain linguistic features of the text attributed to Thomas Beale are more consistent with the vocabulary and style of the 1880s than with the 1820s, a potentially significant observation. Since if the letters were written in the 1880s, they would suggest fabrication rather than genuine historical documents preserved across 60 years. Linguistic analysis of historical documents is a genuinely useful tool, but it requires careful application and honest acknowledgement of its limitations. Language changes gradually, and the boundaries between periods are not sharp. A document from the 1820s preserved and copied by someone in the 1880s might show some linguistic influence from the later era through the copyist's unconscious updating of vocabulary or phrasing. Equally, a skilled fabricator of the 1880s writing in an approximation of 1820s style might not produce a perfect imitation. The linguistic evidence has been interpreted differently by different researchers, and it has not produced a conclusion that commands general agreement. What the 1885 pamphlet undeniably did, whatever its ultimate origin, was introduce the Beale story to a public audience in a form that could be copied, distributed, and discussed. And in doing so, it set in motion the long process of investigation, debate, and speculation that has continued without significant interruption ever since. The pamphlet is the beginning of the public Beale mystery, even if the events it describes, assuming they are genuine, began more than 60 years earlier. The possibility that the Beale papers are not a genuine historical record, but rather an elaborate literary creation, a sophisticated puzzle, or a piece of early American fiction presented as fact, is one that serious researchers have engaged with honestly and carefully. The arguments for this interpretation are not trivial, and presenting them fairly is part of understanding the mystery honestly. The most fundamental skeptical argument is the simplest one. No independent historical evidence for Thomas J. Beale has been confirmed. In a period and region where documentary records were reasonably well maintained, the complete absence of any confirmed corroborating record of a man of Beale's described social standing and activities is a significant evidentiary gap. Researchers who have searched Virginia land records, court documents, tax assessments, and other period archives have not found a Thomas J. Beale whose life corresponds to the narrative in the papers. That absence does not conclusively prove non-existence, but it does mean that the entire story rests on the documents themselves rather than on any external verification. A second skeptical argument concerns the statistical properties of the solved cipher. When cryptographers examine cipher number 2 and the decoded text it supposedly yields, they find a number of irregularities. Instances where the cipher number does not correspond to any word in the declaration at the numbered position, and places where the decoded text requires interpretive generosity to read as coherent English. Some analysts have argued that these irregularities are consistent with what you would expect from a genuine hand-encoded message. Human error is common in such work, while others have suggested that the patterns of error are more consistent with a cipher that was constructed imperfectly. Perhaps because the author was working from the desired plaintext backward rather than encoding a genuine pre-existing message. A third argument involves the convenient structure of the story itself. The narrative, as presented in the 1885 pamphlet, is remarkably well organized from a dramatic perspective. It provides just enough information to be fascinating: a confirmed treasure, a confirmed decoding method for one cipher, and 2 tantalizing unsolved ciphers, while withholding precisely the information that would be needed to verify the central claims or locate the treasure. A fictional author designing a compelling treasure puzzle for public consumption in 1885 might have made exactly these choices. The story has what literary critics sometimes call an elegant economy of mystery. It gives enough to engage and withholds enough to sustain. Some researchers have proposed that James B. Ward himself was the author not just of the pamphlet, but of the entire narrative, including the letters attributed to Beale. Ward, as the pamphlet's editor and publisher, is the one person who is historically documented in connection with the papers, and some analyses of the writing style in the pamphlet's preface and in the letters attributed to Beale have suggested stylistic similarities that might indicate a common author. This remains a theory rather than a demonstrated conclusion, and Ward's descendants and supporters of the paper's authenticity have disputed the characterization. Edgar Allan Poe, whose famous short story, The Gold Bug, published in 1843, featured a decoded treasure cipher and achieved enormous popular success, has sometimes been mentioned in discussions of the Beale papers' possible literary antecedents. Poe's story demonstrated that treasure and cipher narratives had genuine popular appeal in 19th century America, and the Beale papers, published 42 years later, appeared in a cultural context already shaped by that tradition. Whether Poe's work influenced the creation of the Beale papers, if they are fictional, or whether both simply reflect a broader cultural fascination with hidden treasure and cryptographic puzzles, is an interesting contextual question without a definitive answer. The case for taking the Beale papers seriously as a genuine historical document rests on several arguments that researchers supportive of authenticity have developed carefully and that deserve the same honest consideration as the skeptical arguments. Understanding both sides of this debate is essential to appreciating the mystery on its own terms, rather than arriving at a premature conclusion in either direction. The most often cited argument for authenticity involves the structure and statistical properties of the unsolved ciphers. Professional cryptographers who have examined the number distributions in ciphers number 1 and number 3 have found properties that are difficult to explain if the ciphers are simply random numbers or numbers generated without reference to a genuine encoded message. The distribution of values in the ciphers, the range, the frequency patterns, and the relationship between adjacent numbers shows characteristics that cryptographic analysts associate with genuine book ciphers rather than with randomly generated or arbitrarily chosen number sequences. This does not prove that the ciphers encode a recoverable message, but it does suggest that whoever created them had at minimum a sophisticated understanding of how book ciphers work and produced something that behaves statistically as a genuine cipher should. A second argument concerns the geographical and historical plausibility of the frontier expedition narrative. Researchers who have examined the details of the alleged Beale expedition against what is known about frontier travel, Spanish territorial conditions, and mineral deposits in the relevant region during the 1817 to 1821 period have found that the broad outlines of the story are not inconsistent with what was historically possible. Expeditions of similar size and purpose did occur during this period. The regions suggested by the narrative's vague geographical references do contain mineral deposits that were later found to be commercially significant. The social and economic context within which a Virginia gentleman might organize such an expedition and choose to protect its proceeds through encrypted documentation is historically coherent. A third point raised by authenticity advocates concerns the decoded text of cipher number 2 itself. If the cipher is a fabrication, then the decoder, whether Ward or some other party, would have needed to construct a set of numbers that, when the Declaration of Independence was applied as a key, produced a coherent English message. This is not an impossible task, but it is a technically demanding one, requiring a clear understanding of how book ciphers work and careful attention to the number of available key letters at each position in the declaration. The argument is that the level of cryptographic competence required to fabricate a convincing book cipher in 1885 was somewhat more specialized than is sometimes assumed, and that the existence of a genuinely decodable cipher is itself evidence, though not proof, that someone with real knowledge of the technique created the document. The question of authenticity, as researchers in this field generally acknowledge, is unlikely ever to be definitively resolved without the discovery of significant new historical evidence. A confirmed record of Thomas J. Beale independent documentation of the frontier expedition, or a verified solution to one of the unsolved ciphers that produces coherent and historically verifiable content. Absent such evidence, the debate between skeptics and supporters of authenticity continues on the basis of the existing documents and the interpretations they invite, neither side able to claim a conclusive victory. Whatever the ultimate truth of the Beale Papers, one of their most historically significant effects has been entirely real and thoroughly documented. The decades of active searching that they inspired across the hills and valleys of Bedford County, Virginia. From the years immediately following the pamphlet's 1885 publication through to the present day, the landscape around the area described in the papers has attracted a steady procession of searchers, each bringing their own combination of determination, method, and hope to a puzzle that has consistently rewarded persistence with questions rather than answers. The earliest searches were largely informal, individuals who had read the pamphlet and decided to spend time examining the terrain of Bedford County with nothing more sophisticated than shovels and their own best interpretation of the decoded ciphers' vague location description. The decoded text of Cipher No. 2 mentions a vault roughly 6 feet below the surface in a particular county, but the location cipher that would provide specific geographical coordinates remains unsolved, meaning that treasure hunters working without a solution to that cipher have been in effect searching a very large area on the basis of very limited directional information. The geography of Bedford County itself is worth spending a moment with. Situated in the Virginia Piedmont, with the Blue Ridge Mountains forming its western horizon, Bedford County is a landscape of rolling hills, mixed hardwood forests, small river valleys, and red clay soil that has been farmed and walked and quietly inhabited since the earliest European settlement of the region. It is not a dramatic or spectacular landscape in the manner of western mountains or coastal cliffs, but it has a particular beauty that comes from long inhabitation and gentle undulation, the kind of countryside where history feels close to the surface in a way that more remote landscapes sometimes do not. Organized treasure hunting expeditions began arriving in the area within years of the pamphlet's publication, and their history through the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a story of recurring patterns, hopeful beginnings, methodical searching, and quiet conclusions without significant finds. Some expeditions were led by individuals who had developed their own theories about the treasure's location based on their reading of the decoded cipher and their knowledge of the local geography. Others employed dowsing rods, the use of which was taken seriously by some treasure hunters of the era despite the absence of any scientific evidence for its effectiveness. The methods varied considerably. The results were consistent. Local residents of Bedford County have, across the generations, maintained a relationship with the Beale legend that combines genuine familiarity with measured skepticism. For people who have grown up in the area, the story of the buried treasure is a piece of regional heritage, something known and discussed and occasionally smiled at with the particular affectionate skepticism that communities develop toward legends that have surrounded them long enough to become part of the local identity. The treasure hunters who arrive from outside the county are a familiar sight in the region's cultural history, expected to leave empty-handed, and generally treated with the courteous hospitality that Virginia has long considered one of its better traditions. For most of the century, that followed the publication of the Beale pamphlet, the tools available to researchers attempting to solve the remaining ciphers were the same tools available to anyone working on a difficult puzzle, paper-pencil patience. And whatever reference materials could be assembled in a library or a private study. The work was slow, methodical, and often discouraging, requiring the kind of sustained concentration that only genuine conviction about a problem's importance can sustain across months and years of unrewarded effort. And yet researchers kept returning to the ciphers, kept proposing new candidate key texts, kept testing and recording and setting aside their results, because the possibility that the next text tried might be the right one never entirely disappeared. The arrival of computing technology in the latter half of the 20th century changed the practical landscape of cipher research in ways that earlier generations of Beale researchers could not have anticipated. A computer capable of testing thousands of candidate key texts against an encoded cipher in the time that a human researcher might spend carefully working through a single candidate represented an enormous expansion of the search space that could realistically be covered in any given research effort. The Beale ciphers, as one of the most famous unsolved cipher problems in American history, naturally attracted the attention of researchers interested in applying these new computational tools to an old and stubbornly resistant puzzle. The National Security Agency, the United States government's primary signals intelligence and cryptanalysis organization, has an institutional culture of deep interest in historical cipher problems, partly for the practical reason that techniques developed for historical ciphers sometimes illuminate aspects of cryptographic theory with ongoing relevance. The Beale ciphers have been discussed in publications associated with the NSA's historical and educational programs, most notably in an article published in the agency's internal journal Cryptologic Spectrum in 1980, written by a researcher named Carl Hammer. Hammer's analysis, which applied computer-assisted statistical methods to the unsolved ciphers, concluded that the ciphers showed statistical properties consistent with genuine, encoded messages rather than random number sequences, a finding that has been cited by authenticity supporters as meaningful, though Hammer himself was careful to present his conclusions as suggestive rather than definitive. Subsequent decades of computer-assisted research have tested an enormous number of candidate key texts against ciphers number 1 and number 3 without producing a confirmed solution. Researchers have tried various editions of the Bible, the Federalist Papers' multiple editions, and printings of the Declaration of Independence with different word numberings. Popular books of the early 19th century, legal documents, newspapers, almanacs, and many other texts that would have been available and familiar to someone in Virginia in the 1820s. Each negative result eliminates a candidate from consideration, gradually narrowing the search space, but the remaining space, all the texts that have not yet been systematically tested, remains very large. The application of more sophisticated analytical methods, including various forms of statistical modeling and pattern recognition, has added nuance to the search without producing a breakthrough. Some researchers have used frequency analysis, examining how often particular numbers appear in the cipher and how their frequency distribution compares to what would be expected from a genuine book cipher using a particular type of text. Others have used index of coincidence calculations, a standard cryptographic tool for assessing whether an encoded text shows the statistical fingerprints of a particular language or cipher type. These methods have generally confirmed what Hammer's earlier analysis suggested, that the ciphers behave statistically more like genuine encoded messages than like random or arbitrarily constructed number sequences. But statistical plausibility is not the same as a confirmed solution. More recently, researchers with access to the kind of computational power that has become routinely available through modern personal computers and cloud computing platforms have attempted more comprehensive searches, testing larger libraries of candidate texts with greater speed than was previously possible. Artificial intelligence tools, including natural language processing systems capable of identifying coherent text fragments within partially decoded messages, have been applied to the problem with the hope of recognizing a genuine solution even when the key match is imperfect, as it demonstrably was in Cipher No. 2, where a number of errors in the encoding produced an imperfectly decoded but still readable message. None of these efforts has yet produced a result that the research community has accepted as a genuine solution to either of the remaining ciphers. The possibility that the correct key text has simply not yet been tried remains real. It is also possible that the key text was something that existed in the early 19th century but has since been lost, a privately printed document, a handwritten manuscript, or a local publication of limited distribution that no copy of which survives in any accessible archive. If the key was something of this nature, no amount of computational effort applied to existing historical texts would ever produce a solution, because the right key would simply not be in the search space. This is one of the more sobering possibilities that researchers in this field occasionally allow themselves to consider, because it represents not a failure of method or persistence, but simply an irreversible loss of the specific piece of information that the ciphers were designed to require. There is a particular quality to the Virginia countryside in Bedford County that no amount of historical description quite captures, a quality that you can only begin to approach by imagining yourself standing in it. On a quiet morning when the light is still low and the air carries the particular freshness of a landscape that has been sleeping and is only just beginning to wake. The hills here are not dramatic in the way that mountain landscapes are dramatic. They roll gently, covered in mixed forest and open farmland, the fields bordered by old stone walls and lines of hardwood trees whose roots have been reaching into the Virginia soil for longer than any living person can remember. The Otter River moves through parts of the county with the unhurried pace of a stream that has found its course and sees no particular reason to alter it. The Blue Ridge Mountains form the western horizon, their ridgelines rising against the sky in shades of blue and gray that vary with the season and the weather and the time of day. Closer and more vivid in the clear air of autumn, softer, and more distant in the haze of summer. The landscape has the particular beauty of a place that has been inhabited for a long time without being overwhelmed by that inhabitation, where the evidence of human presence is woven into the natural scenery rather than imposed upon it. It is into this landscape that the Beale narrative places its buried treasure, and whatever one concludes about the story's authenticity, it is not difficult to understand why this particular setting has sustained so many generations of imagination and search. Bedford County's gentle terrain conceals any number of small valleys, rocky outcroppings, old stream beds, and wooded hollows that could serve, in the mind of someone searching for a hidden vault, as a plausible location. The landscape is expansive enough to feel genuinely mysterious and accessible enough to feel searchable, a combination that is perhaps ideal for sustaining a treasure legend across multiple generations. The roads that cross Bedford County today follow routes that in many cases trace the paths of much older roads and trails. The routes along which wagons moved in the early 19th century, along which mail riders traveled, along which the people of this community connected themselves to one another and to the wider world of commerce and communication that Lynchburg anchored for the region. Walking or driving these routes, it is not difficult to imagine the landscape as it would have appeared in the 1820s. Because the fundamental geography has not changed, the hills are in the same places, the rivers follow the same valleys, and the distances between places are the same distances that travelers of the early Republic era would have measured in hours of riding rather than minutes of driving. The specific geography described in the decoded portion of Cipher No. 2, a vault roughly 6 feet below the surface in Bedford County, is frustratingly general as a location description. Bedford County covers more than 750 square miles of terrain, and a buried cache in a sealed vault that has been underground for 2 centuries would leave no surface indication of its presence detectable by ordinary observation. Ground cover changes, trees grow and fall and grow again, seasonal flooding redistributes surface soil, and 2 centuries of farming, road building, and general land use have altered the surface characteristics of much of the county in ways that make any above-ground search essentially hopeless without additional directional information. This is precisely why Cipher No. 1, the location cipher, matters so much to anyone seriously interested in the treasure question. Without a solution to that cipher, the landscape of Bedford County is simply a beautiful piece of Virginia countryside with a legend attached to it, rather than a searchable territory with a specific target. The geography invites imagination without rewarding specific action, which is perhaps why the Beale mystery has sustained so many years of interest without producing the kind of definitive resolution that a more precisely locatable treasure might have provided long ago. The tradition of searching for the Beale treasure has not diminished with the passage of time so much as it has evolved. Adapting to new technologies and new social contexts, while maintaining the fundamental character of a search driven by genuine curiosity and the particular human fascination with the idea of hidden wealth waiting to be recovered. The modern treasure hunter who arrives in Bedford County bearing the latest in ground-penetrating radar equipment and a carefully researched theory about the Ciphers solution is in some ways a very different figure from the 19th century searcher with a shovel and a copy of the pamphlet, and in other ways recognizably the same person, driven by the same combination of intellectual engagement with the puzzle and imaginative investment in the possibility of discovery. Ground-penetrating radar, a technology that uses radio waves to detect anomalies beneath the surface without requiring excavation, has been applied to various locations in Bedford County by researchers who believe they have identified promising areas based on their analysis of the available evidence. The technology is genuinely capable of detecting buried voids, metallic objects, and density anomalies that might indicate an underground vault or a large buried cache. But it requires knowing where to look, and without a solution to the location cipher. The choice of where to apply it remains necessarily speculative. Reports of ground-penetrating radar surveys in the area have appeared in treasure hunting literature over the years, but none has produced publicly confirmed evidence of a find consistent with the Beale treasure description. Metal detectors, which are sensitive to the electromagnetic signatures of buried metallic objects and have become increasingly sophisticated in their discrimination and depth capabilities, have also been deployed in the search. The practical limitations of metal detection in this context are significant. The depth at which a buried vault of the kind described in the decoded cipher would lie is at the outer edge of what most metal detectors can reliably reach. And the size of Bedford County means that systematic metal detection coverage of even a small portion of it would require an enormous investment of time. Nevertheless, metal detecting enthusiasts have included Bedford County in their activities over the years, occasionally reporting finds of old coins or metal artifacts that, while historically interesting in their own right, have not been connected to the Beale treasure story with any evidentiary confidence. The legal framework surrounding treasure hunting on private and public land in Virginia, as in most American states, places important constraints on what searchers can legitimately do. Digging on private property without the landowner's explicit permission is trespassing, and the recovery of historically significant artifacts on any land is subject to state and federal regulations designed to protect the archaeological record. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources maintains oversight of archaeological activities in the state, and the discovery of genuinely significant historical material would be subject to reporting requirements and potentially to state authority over its disposition. Responsible treasure hunters and the community of serious Beale researchers includes many people who take their legal and ethical obligations seriously, work within these constraints, seeking appropriate permissions before conducting any ground-disturbing activities, and approaching the search as a form of historical investigation rather than simply a commercial enterprise. The Beale Cipher Association, a non-profit organization that has coordinated research and search activities related to the Beale Papers, has historically emphasized responsible methods and the importance of maintaining good relationships with landowners and local communities in Bedford County. Their approach reflects an understanding that the treasure, if it exists and is ever found, is embedded in a living community whose interests and rights are as real and as important as the historical puzzle itself. The cultural life of the Beale Papers extends far beyond the practical activities of treasure hunters and cryptographers. Since the pamphlet's publication in 1885, and especially since the story found wider audiences through reprinting and media coverage in the 20th century, the Beale mystery has occupied a distinctive place in American popular culture, functioning as one of those recurring national stories that each generation rediscovers and engages with on its own terms. Newspaper coverage of the Beale mystery has appeared periodically throughout the 20th century, typically in connection with new searches, new proposed solutions to the ciphers, or anniversary retrospectives on the story's longevity. These articles have introduced the story to successive generations of readers who might not otherwise have encountered it, and they have consistently found an audience interested in both the cryptographic puzzle and the treasure narrative. The combination of historical atmosphere, intellectual challenge, and the possibility of genuine buried wealth has proven to be exactly the kind of story that newspaper editors know their readers will engage with, which helps explain why coverage has continued regularly across more than a century. Books devoted entirely or substantially to the Beale Papers have appeared at intervals since the early 20th century, ranging from straightforward retellings of the story to serious analytical investigations of the ciphers and the historical evidence. Some of these books have proposed specific solutions to the unsolved ciphers, advancing theories about which texts might serve as keys and presenting decoded results that their authors argue are meaningful. None of these proposed solutions has achieved general acceptance, but each has added to the body of discussion and analysis surrounding the papers and has introduced new readers to a mystery that rewards the kind of careful, patient engagement that a book-length treatment makes possible. Television has visited the Beale story on multiple occasions, including episodes of documentary programs dedicated to American treasure legends and historical mysteries. These productions have varied considerably in their approach, some treating the story with genuine historical seriousness, others leaning more heavily into the atmospheric elements of the treasure narrative. The most responsible of these productions have been careful to distinguish between what the documents claim and what independent evidence supports, presenting the mystery honestly as an open question rather than as a solved case that only needs its final details confirmed. The internet has given the Beale mystery a new kind of life in the 21st century, creating communities of researchers and enthusiasts who share analysis, propose theories, compare notes on search activities, and maintain the story's presence in a global conversation about historical puzzles. Online forums and websites dedicated to the Beale Papers have accumulated enormous quantities of research, speculation, and documentation, making the full history of attempts to solve the mystery more accessible than it has ever been before. This accessibility has both benefits and challenges. It lowers the barrier for new researchers entering the field and allows genuine collaboration across distances. But it also means that well-founded historical analysis and unfounded speculation exist side by side in a digital environment that does not always make it easy to distinguish between them. What the cultural history of the Beale Papers demonstrates. Across all of these different media and all of these different generations of engagement is something rather straightforward about human nature. That puzzles which combine intellectual challenge with the possibility of tangible reward embedded in a story with genuine historical texture and atmospheric appeal, have a very long half-life in the popular imagination. The Beale mystery has survived not because it has been solved, and not despite the fact that it has not been solved, but in some sense because of it, because the unresolved cipher pages continue to extend an open invitation that each new generation finds in its own way worth accepting. Beyond its place in American treasure, legend, and popular culture, the Beale Papers have had a quiet but genuine influence on the history of cryptography as a field of study and as a form of intellectual culture in the United States. This influence operates on several levels: in the practical history of cipher analysis, in the broader culture of puzzle solving and amateur cryptography, and in the way the Beale story has served as an accessible entry point into cryptographic thinking for generations of curious readers. The puzzle of the unsolved Beale ciphers has, over the decades, attracted serious attention from professional cryptographers whose primary work lies in very different domains. The challenge of solving a historical cipher without a known key is a genuinely interesting cryptographic problem, and the Beale case presents that problem in an unusually well-documented and publicly accessible form. Researchers who have engaged with the Beale ciphers as a cryptographic exercise have sometimes developed or refined analytical methods in the process that have broader applications in the field. The kind of cross-pollination between a specific problem and general technique development that characterizes healthy scientific inquiry. The American Cryptogram Association, a non-profit organization founded in 1929 that promotes the study and practice of cryptography among amateur enthusiasts, has maintained a long institutional interest in the Beale Papers. The association's membership has contributed numerous analyses of the ciphers over the decades, published in the organization's journal, The Cryptogram, and representing a sustained engagement with the problem that has generated both useful analytical work and a sense of community around a shared intellectual challenge. The Beale ciphers have served within this community as a kind of perpetual examination problem, always available, never exhausted, endlessly capable of generating new approaches and new discussions. The academic study of cryptography, which has expanded enormously in the computer age and has become one of the most practically important fields of applied mathematics and computer science, has maintained a connection to historical cipher problems, including the Beale case. Courses in cryptography at universities sometimes use the Beale Papers as a teaching example. The Unsolved cipher providing a clear illustration of how a book cipher works in practice. While the Unsolved ciphers raise important questions about the limits of cryptanalysis and the role of the key in cipher security. As a pedagogical tool, the Beale Papers have the considerable advantage of being inherently interesting to students in a way that purely abstract cipher examples sometimes are not. Perhaps most broadly, the Beale mystery has contributed to a general cultural awareness in the United States, especially that cryptography is not simply a technical specialty for mathematicians and intelligence professionals, but a human activity with a long and fascinating history, one that intersects with stories of adventure, treasure, personal loyalty, and the enduring human desire to protect information from those not intended to receive it. The book cipher that lies at the heart of the Beale Papers is, at its core, a very human solution to a very human problem. How do you trust a message to survive a world full of people who might want to intercept it? That question has not become less relevant with time, which is one reason the cryptographic dimension of the Beale story continues to feel alive rather than merely historical. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that the best historical investigation requires, the willingness to distinguish carefully between what the evidence actually supports and what we might wish it to support. Between what can be stated with reasonable confidence and what must be held at arm's length as possibility rather than fact. The Beale Papers, perhaps more than most historical mysteries, demand this kind of honesty, because the story is constructed in a way that makes it easy to slide, almost without noticing, from careful assessment into comfortable assumption. Spending a quiet moment with what the evidence actually tells us and what it does not is one of the most useful things we can do before this journey draws to a close. What can be stated with reasonable historical confidence is this. A pamphlet titled The Beale Papers was published in Lynchburg, Virginia, in 1885, attributed to James B. Ward. That pamphlet contained 3 pages of numbers, several letters in plain English attributed to a man named Thomas J. Beale, and a narrative account of how the papers came to be published. The pamphlet is a real historical document. Copies of it survive. It has been examined, reprinted, and discussed by researchers across nearly a century and a half of continuous engagement. Its physical existence is not in question. What can also be stated with confidence is that the second of the 3 numbered pages yields a coherent English text when the Declaration of Independence is used as a key in the manner of a book cipher, with each number in the cipher corresponding to the first letter of the word at that position in the declaration. The decoded text describes a buried cache of gold, silver, and jewels in Bedford County, Virginia. The decoding is imperfect in several places, with errors and inconsistencies, but the overall message is readable and internally consistent with the narrative provided in the accompanying letters. This decoding is real. It works. Whether it was created by a genuine 19th century frontiersman or by a skilled 19th century literary craftsman is the question that the decoding itself cannot answer. What cannot be stated with confidence because the evidence does not support it, is the independent historical existence of Thomas J. Beale as a documented person. No confirmed records of a Thomas J. Beale consistent with the narrative in the papers have been found in the relevant Virginia archives, despite serious research efforts by qualified historians. This absence is significant and should be acknowledged honestly rather than minimized. It does not conclusively prove that the papers are fabricated, but it does mean that the entire narrative rests on the documents themselves rather than on any external corroboration. What remains entirely unresolved, and may remain so indefinitely, is whether ciphers number 1 and number 3 encode genuine messages. The statistical properties of these ciphers are consistent with genuine book ciphers, according to the analyses that have been conducted. But statistical consistency is not the same as confirmed authenticity. A sophisticated creator could, in principle, have generated number sequences that passed statistical tests without encoding a recoverable message. The distinction between a genuine unsolved cipher and a convincing imitation of one is, without the key, very difficult to establish from the outside with any degree of certainty. What remains equally unresolved is the question of whether any treasure exists beneath the soil of Bedford County, Virginia. If the papers are genuine, and if the treasure was buried as described, and if it has not been found or removed in the intervening 2 centuries, then the possibility that it remains where it was placed exists. If the papers are a literary creation, then the treasure exists only as a narrative element, real within the story but not beneath the ground. The evidence available does not allow us to determine which of these possibilities is correct, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely in either direction. What we can say with complete confidence and without any qualification is that the Beale Papers have been one of the most durably fascinating documents in American popular and intellectual history. Whatever their origin, they have inspired genuine cryptographic research, genuine historical investigation, genuine community around a shared intellectual puzzle, and genuine wonder in the minds of everyone who has encountered them with an open and curious spirit. That influence is real, documented, and in its own way remarkable, a testament to the power of a well-constructed mystery to engage human curiosity across long periods of time. It would feel incomplete in a documentary that has tried to be honest about this mystery from every angle. To move toward a conclusion without spending one final quiet moment with the hoax question, not to resolve it because it cannot be resolved with the evidence currently available, but to appreciate it in its full complexity rather than dismissing it as a simple either-or proposition. The word hoax carries implications that may not be entirely fair to whatever the Beale Papers actually represent. A hoax, in the most common understanding of the word, is a deception designed to mislead people for the benefit of the deceiver, something created in bad faith, intended to cause harm or extract money or undermine trust. If the Beale Papers are not a genuine historical record, it is worth asking whether that necessarily makes them a hoax in this sense, or whether they might represent something more nuanced and more interesting. One possibility that some researchers have considered is that the papers represent a form of early American literary puzzle, something created not to deceive readers into believing a false story, but to engage them in a genuine intellectual exercise, with the understanding that the entertainment and the intellectual challenge were the real product rather than the treasure narrative. Edgar Allan Poe, whose Gold Bug was discussed earlier in this documentary, understood that the pleasure of a cipher story lay as much in the puzzle as in the solution. And it is possible to imagine a creator of the Beale Papers working in a similar spirit, constructing an elaborate and internally consistent puzzle for the pleasure of those who would engage with it, without necessarily intending the treasure story to be taken as literal truth. Another possibility is that the papers represent something between pure invention and pure historical record, a narrative built around a real event or a real person, elaborated and fictionalized in the process of being written down. In the way that oral traditions and personal memoirs sometimes blur the boundary between what happened and what is remembered as having happened. Early American popular literature frequently mixed factual and fictional elements in ways that modern readers might find surprising, and the conventions of that era did not always demand the sharp distinction between reportage and invention that later journalistic and historical standards would come to require. James B. Ward, whose role in bringing the papers to publication is the one genuinely documented historical fact in the entire story, remains a figure of considerable interpretive interest. If Ward fabricated the entire narrative, he did so with a level of technical cryptographic sophistication and historical knowledge that commands a certain reluctant admiration. If he genuinely received the papers from Robert Morris and published them in good faith, he was doing what he claimed, preserving a remarkable document and offering it to the public in the hope that someone might eventually solve its remaining mysteries. The historical record does not allow us to determine which of these characterizations is accurate, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself part of what the story has always been about. What the hoax question ultimately teaches us, when engaged with honestly, is something about the nature of historical evidence and the limits of what investigation alone can establish. Some questions about the past cannot be answered with the materials that have survived, not because the truth did not exist, but because the specific evidence that would have established it was never created, or was created and then lost, or was deliberately withheld. The Beale Papers sit in that category of historical puzzles where the surviving evidence is genuinely insufficient to support a confident conclusion, and where intellectual honesty requires sitting with uncertainty rather than reaching past it toward a resolution that the facts do not support. There is a question that follows naturally from everything we have explored tonight, and it is perhaps the most interesting question of all, not whether the treasure exists, not whether the ciphers can be solved, but why this particular story. Among all the treasure legends and historical mysteries that American history has produced, has endured with such remarkable persistence across nearly 2 centuries of changing culture, changing technology, and changing public taste. America has no shortage of treasure legends. Spanish gold buried in the Southwest. Confederate Treasury funds allegedly hidden during the final days of the Civil War pirate caches along the Atlantic coast. Lost mines in dozens of mountain ranges from the Appalachians to the Rockies. The American landscape is populated with stories of hidden wealth that have attached themselves to particular places and persisted in local memory across generations. Most of these stories remain purely local, known to people in the communities where they originated and rarely attracting sustained national attention. The Beale Papers are different. They have consistently found audiences far beyond Bedford County, Virginia, and far beyond any single generation of American readers. Part of the explanation lies in the specific combination of elements the story contains. The Beale Papers are not merely a treasure legend. They are a treasure legend with a genuine cryptographic puzzle at their center, and that puzzle gives the story an intellectual dimension that most treasure narratives lack. Anyone who encounters the Beale Papers can engage with them not just as a story to be believed or disbelieved, but as a problem to be worked on, a set of numbers that might in principle yield to the right approach, and that have not yet done so despite enormous effort from enormously capable people. That open invitation to intellectual engagement is part of what makes the story feel alive rather than merely historical. The specific historical context in which the story is set also contributes to its durability. The early American Republic, with its expansive frontier, its culture of individual enterprise and adventure, and its foundational national documents, including the Declaration of Independence, whose use as a cipher key gives the Beale story a distinctive patriotic resonance, is a period of American history that has maintained a powerful hold on the national imagination. Setting a treasure story in that era, connecting it to that founding document, and embedding it in the landscape of Virginia, the state most closely associated with the nation's founders, gives the Beale narrative a cultural weight that a story set in less symbolically charged circumstances might not carry. The human element of the story also matters. The image of men who went far into the wilderness, found something remarkable, and took careful steps to protect what they had found for the benefit of people they cared about. Whatever one concludes about the historical truth of the Beale narrative, the human motivations it attributes to its central figure are recognizable and sympathetic ones. The desire to provide for those left behind, to create a form of security that would survive one's own possible death in a dangerous undertaking. To trust a stranger with something important and to honor that trust by leaving a recoverable key. These are motivations that connect across centuries to something genuinely human, and the story's emotional core rests on them as much as on the promise of buried gold. There is also something to be said for the particular quality of unresolved mysteries as cultural objects. A mystery that has been solved stops being a mystery and becomes a historical fact. Interesting, certainly, but no longer inviting active engagement. A mystery that remains genuinely open continues to extend its invitation indefinitely, each generation finding in it the same combination of intellectual challenge and imaginative possibility that earlier generations found. The Beale Papers have remained open long enough that they have become a kind of shared cultural inheritance, a puzzle that belongs in some sense to anyone who chooses to engage with it, regardless of when they were born or where they live or what tools they bring to the task. Let us take one final walk together through the landscape where this story lives, not searching for anything in particular, not expecting any revelations, but simply moving through the quiet countryside of Bedford County, Virginia, as the evening light begins to soften and the long day draws toward its close. The road that leads through the heart of the county is narrow and unhurried, following the gentle curves of the terrain rather than cutting through it in the modern manner. Hardwood trees line the roadside, oak and hickory, and the occasional old walnut, their canopies meeting overhead in some places to form the kind of tunnel of leaves that country roads in Virginia have offered travelers for as long as there have been travelers on these roads. The light comes through the leaves in the late afternoon in a particular way, broken and warm and slightly golden, the kind of light that makes even ordinary landscapes feel momentarily significant. You walk slowly because the landscape invites slowness. There is no urgency in the rolling fields on either side of the road. No urgency in the distant line of the Blue Ridge Mountains holding their position against the western sky exactly as they have held it through all the seasons of all the years that anyone has been in this place to observe them. The mountains were here before the road, before the fields, before the farms and the towns and the legend of the buried treasure. They will be here, in all likelihood, long after the last searcher has gone home and the last computer has finished its analysis of the cipher pages. Somewhere in this landscape, or perhaps nowhere in this landscape, a vault may lie beneath the surface of the red Virginia earth, sealed and patient and entirely indifferent to the centuries of human attention directed toward finding it. The possibility of its presence is one of those things that changes the quality of attention you bring to the scenery around you, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that makes the fields and forests feel like the backdrop for an adventure, but in a quieter way that makes you notice things you might otherwise pass without seeing. The particular way a hillside catches the late light, the depth of shade under a stand of old trees. The place where a small stream crosses beneath the road, visible for a moment and then gone. The Beale Papers have been doing this to people for nearly 200 years, adjusting the quality of attention they bring to this particular landscape, making them notice the depth of the soil and the age of the trees and the quiet geography of a countryside that in all other respects might seem entirely ordinary. Whatever the ultimate truth of the story, this perceptual gift is real. The people who have come here because of the Beale Papers have seen this landscape with a particular intentness that ordinary travelers rarely bring to a rural Virginia county, and in doing so they have in their way paid it a form of attention that the landscape probably does not need, but that says something genuine about the relationship between human curiosity and the physical world. The evening is settling in now, the light moving from gold to a softer amber as the sun continues its descent toward the mountain ridges to the west. The air is cooling slightly, carrying the particular freshness of a Virginia evening in early autumn, a freshness that smells of dry leaves and field grass and the faint mineral coolness of nearby water. A single cricket has begun its calling from somewhere in the grass beside the road, and then another, and gradually the sound builds into the quiet chorus that will accompany the night from now until dawn. You pause for a moment at the crest of a small hill, looking out across the valley below, a patchwork of fields and woodlots and the occasional farmhouse with its evening lights just beginning to show through the darkening air. The Blue Ridge is a long, dark silhouette now against a sky that has shifted from pale blue through lavender and is moving steadily toward the deep, clear darkness that will eventually reveal the stars. In a few hours, if the night is clear, the sky above this valley will be filled with more stars than most modern Americans ever see. A reminder that the darkness that once covered this landscape every night before electric light changed the relationship between human beings and the night sky was also a kind of presence. A vast and patient companion to everything that happened beneath it. The locked iron box that Robert Morris received from a well-spoken traveler in Lynchburg, Virginia, sometime in the 1820s, if the story is to be believed, sat for years in a back room of his inn while the world outside continued its ordinary business. Wars were fought and concluded, presidents came and went. The frontier that Beale supposedly rode into gradually became settled territory, mapped and measured, and divided into counties and townships and private landholdings. The railroad arrived and changed the pace of travel. The telegraph arrived and changed the pace of communication. And through all of it, if the story is true, the iron box sat undisturbed, holding its numbers and its letters and its promise of something buried and waiting. When Morris finally opened the box, when Ward finally published the pamphlet, when the first readers in 1885 unfolded those pages and read the cipher numbers for the first time, something that had been private became public, and in becoming public, it became, in a sense, everyone's. The Beale mystery does not belong to any single person, or any single institution, or any single generation. It belongs to the long, patient tradition of human curiosity that has kept it alive across all the years since those numbers first appeared in print, and that continues, in its quiet way, to keep it alive tonight. The road continues ahead, curving gently around the next hillside and disappearing into the trees. The cricket chorus has settled into its full evening rhythm now, steady and unhurried and entirely comfortable with the gathering dark. The mountains have become shapes rather than landscapes, their details merged into the general darkening of the western horizon. Perhaps the numbers on those 3 pages encode genuine directions to a genuine buried vault. Perhaps they are an elaborate and skillfully constructed puzzle created by a gifted literary mind. Perhaps they are something in between, a narrative built around partial truth, shaped by imagination, and preserved by the particular power that certain stories have to make themselves necessary to the people who encounter them. What they certainly are, whatever else may be true or uncertain about them, is a door left open, a question asked in one century and not yet answered in another. An invitation extended across nearly 200 years to anyone with the patience to sit with a difficult problem and the humility to accept that some questions may never fully resolve, and that there is a particular kind of wisdom available in that acceptance. A quietness that comes from being comfortable with what remains unknown. The stars are beginning to appear now, one by one at first, and then in growing numbers as the sky deepens. The Milky Way will follow, a soft band of ancient light stretching from one horizon to the other above the quiet Virginia countryside. The fields are dark and still. The trees are dark and still. The hills hold their familiar shapes against the sky. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the old soil of Bedford County, beneath the roots of trees that were saplings when the mystery began, beneath the patient layers of Virginia earth that have been settling and shifting and rearranging themselves with geological slowness across all the centuries of human attention directed toward them, the answer to the question either exists or it does not. Either there is something there sealed in iron, waiting with the particular patience of things that cannot wait actively, but only endure, or there is simply the earth itself, rich and dark and full of its own ancient history that has nothing to do with gold or silver or the ambitions of any particular group of early American frontiersmen. We cannot know which is true tonight. We may never know with certainty which is true. And perhaps, if we sit quietly enough with that uncertainty, comfortable in the cool Virginia evening, watching the stars appear one by one above the patient hills, perhaps that is not entirely a loss. Perhaps the question itself, held open across all these years, has given us something that a simple answer would have taken away. The long, continuing conversation between human curiosity and the enduring silence of the landscape that keeps its own counsel, as landscapes always have, as they always will. Rest now, the hills of Virginia are quiet, and the stars are out, and the mystery rests as it has always rested, gently, without urgency, in the patient dark. Thank you for spending this evening with History's Sleepy Time. If these quiet journeys through history bring you peace at the end of a long day, we would be honored to have you with us for the next one. Sleep well. And wherever you are tonight, whatever landscape surrounds you as you close your eyes, may it hold its own quiet mysteries, and may you rest easily within them.